I'm Sarah Mitchell, 32, a marketing director at a Fortune 500 company in Chicago. After 5 years of 60-hour weeks and record-breaking campaigns, I thought I'd earned my place at the table. When I walked into HR to discuss my maternity leave, I expected paperwork and congratulations. Instead, Corinne from HR leaned back in her chair and said, "Maybe you should find a new job that's more compatible with your new priorities." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My hand instinctively moved to my barely there bump, protecting the life growing inside me. I'd always been the company's golden girl, the one who stayed late, who traveled without complaint, who made everyone else look good. But apparently, the moment I needed something back, I became expendable. What happened next would teach them exactly what they'd lost and what I was truly capable of when pushed too far. If you've ever felt undervalued at work or faced discrimination, subscribe for stories of justice and empowerment. 5 years ago, I walked into Meridian Corporation's gleaming downtown Chicago offices with nothing but ambition and a Northwestern marketing degree. The company specialized in luxury hospitality management, and I was determined to prove myself. In their competitive world, on my first day, I clutched a leather portfolio containing my resume, references, and a detailed analysis of their biggest competitor's marketing strategy. I'd spent weeks preparing, studying every campaign they'd run for the past 3 years. When my new boss, David Chun, asked what I thought of their current approach, I didn't hesitate. "Your messaging is strong, but you're missing the emotional connection," I said, pulling out my analysis. "Luxury isn't just about thread count and marble bathrooms. It's about moments, the way a guest feels when they walk into a room that understands them perfectly." David's eyebrows rose. By the end of that first week, I was leading the rebranding of their boutique hotel chain in Denver. The years that followed were a blur of early mornings, late nights, and constant travel. I missed my college roommate's wedding because I was in Miami launching a campaign. I canceled Christmas dinner with my parents to handle a crisis in Seattle. I lived on coffee, takeout, and the adrenaline rush of closing deals. But God, I loved it. The Riverside Hotels campaign became my masterpiece. We were competing for a contract to market a chain of historic properties across New England. The client wanted something fresh but respectful of the building's heritage. I spent 3 months researching each property's history, interviewing longtime staff members, and even staying in several of the hotels myself. The campaign I created told the story of lives lived here, featuring real guests whose lives had been touched by these hotels. A couple who'd honeymooned at the Boston location 50 years ago. A business executive who'd closed her first major deal in the Vermont Properties Library. A family that had held 4 generations of reunions at the same Connecticut hotel. I presented to the client. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. We won the contract worth $12 million over 3 years. The campaign won industry awards and was featured in Marketing Today magazine. David promoted me to senior marketing manager, then to associate director within 2 years. By my 4th year, I was the youngest marketing director in the companies. History. My office wall became a gallery of achievement plaques, client thank you letters, and photos from industry events. Employee of the month 6 times. The President's Circle for exceeding targets. The Innovation Award for the Riverside campaign. I kept detailed notes from every meeting, every strategy session, every client interaction. My filing system was meticulous color-coded. Folders for each project, timeline charts, post-campaign analysis reports. When other departments needed marketing support, they asked for me specifically. It was during a networking event at the Palmer House that I met Tom. He was there representing his architecture firm, and I was there with potential clients. We found ourselves at the same cocktail table, both awkwardly trying to avoid the overly aggressive real estate developer who'd cornered us. "Want to make a break for it?" Tom whispered, Gesturing toward the exit, we escaped to a quiet bar down the street where he told me about designing sustainable office buildings, and I explained the psychology of luxury marketing. We talked until the place closed, then walked along the lakefront until sunrise. 3 years later, we were married in a small ceremony in Grant Park. Even then, I'd scheduled it around my travel calendar. Tom understood my dedication to work. He'd seen me cry with frustration over difficult clients, celebrate victories with champagne and Chinese takeout, and work through weekends when deadlines loomed. He never complained when I missed dinner parties or had to take calls during our dates. "You're building something," he'd say. "I respect that." By my 5th year, I was managing a team of 12, overseeing campaigns worth millions, and earning more than I'd ever dreamed possible. I had my own parking spot, a corner office with a view of the lake, and the respect of colleagues who'd once seen me as the eager kid with big ideas. I thought I'd proven myself beyond question. I thought I'd earned my place at the table permanently. I was wrong. For 2 years, Tom and I had been trying to start a family. What began as casual conversations about someday became scheduled appointments. Temperature charts and fertility specialists. Each negative test felt like a personal failure. Another thing I couldn't control or achieve through sheer determination. Dr. Patricia Hernandez. Our reproductive endocrinologist had kind eyes but realistic expectations. "Sometimes these things take time," she'd say, reviewing our test results. "Your stress levels are quite high, Sarah. The demands of your job might be affecting your hormones." I bristled at that. How many men had been told their careers were preventing pregnancy? But privately, I wondered if she was right. Between the constant travel, the pressure to perform, and the 12-hour days, my body rarely felt like my own. The fertility treatments were brutal. Hormone injections that made me emotional and exhausted. Procedures that required precise timing, often conflicting with important meetings. I'd sneak out of client presentations to take shots in restaurant bathrooms, praying no one would notice. My absence. Tom was patient through it all, holding me when I cried after each failed cycle, researching alternative treatments, and never once suggesting I slow down at work. But I saw the disappointment in his eyes, the way he'd look at families with children when we went out to dinner. "Maybe we should take a break from trying," I said one evening after our 3rd failed IVF cycle. "Focus on other things for a while." Tom nodded, but I could see the sadness in his shoulders. We'd spent so much energy hoping, planning, and grieving that we'd forgotten how to just be together. So we did take a break. We went to Napa Valley for a long weekend, something we hadn't done in months. We slept in, shared lazy breakfasts, and didn't talk about ovulation schedules or doctor appointments. For the first time in 2 years, I turned off my work phone for 3 entire days. When we got home, I felt lighter somehow. The constant pressure of trying to conceive had lifted, and I threw myself back into work with renewed energy. The Peterson Hotel's pitch was coming up, a massive opportunity that could establish us as the premier luxury hospitality marketing firm in the Midwest. I spent weeks preparing, analyzing market trends, developing creative concepts that would blow away the competition. The presentation went perfectly. We won the contract worth $15 million over 4 years. That night, Tom and I celebrated with champagne and sushi from our favorite place. We made love without thinking about timing or positioning, just because we wanted to connect with each other. 3 weeks later, I was in the bathroom at work, feeling nauseous after my morning coffee. The flu was going around my office, and I'd assumed I was coming down with something. But as I splashed cold water on my face, a thought
struck me. I stopped at the pharmacy on my way home,
buying a pregnancy test along with aspirin and throat lozenges to throw off suspicion. In my bathroom, hands shaking, I followed the instructions I'd memorized from dozens of previous attempts. 2 pink lines appeared almost immediately. I sat on the bathroom floor, staring at the test, hardly believing it was real. After 2 years of trying countless medical appointments and thousands of dollars in treatments, it had happened naturally when we'd stopped trying. When Tom got home, he found me sitting at the kitchen table, the test in front of me, like evidence of a miracle. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I took 3 tests," I said, laughing through tears. "All positive." He picked me up and spun me around, both of us crying and laughing at the same time. We called our parents, my sister, his brother. We started making lists of baby names and nursery colors. For the first time in my adult life, something mattered more than my career, but I didn't know that would be a problem. At 12 weeks, after the first ultrasound showed a healthy baby with a strong heartbeat, I decided it was time to start planning for maternity leave. I'd always been a planner. It's what made me good at my job, and pregnancy was no different. I pulled out the employee handbook I'd received 5 years ago and found the section on family leave. The policy seemed straightforward enough: 12 weeks unpaid leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act, with the option to use accrued sick days and vacation time for partial pay. The company would maintain my health insurance during leave, and I returned to the same position at the same salary. I highlighted the relevant sections and made notes in the margins. Then I printed out the federal FMLA guidelines from the Department of Labor website, cross-referencing them with Illinois state laws. Everything seemed to support my right to take leave without fear of retaliation. Next, I created a comprehensive transition plan. I made detailed notes on every active project, including client contact information, campaign timelines, and budget considerations. I outlined which team members could handle specific responsibilities and identified external vendors who might need additional oversight. Hotel's campaign would be in full swing during my leave, but I'd structured it so that my associate director, Michael, could manage the day-to-day operations. I created a detailed handover document with everything he'd need to know. I even drafted emails to key clients, explaining that I'd be taking maternity leave, but ensuring them that their projects would continue seamlessly. I wanted to be transparent and professional, maintaining the relationships I'd worked so hard to build. Tom and I had long conversations about our finances. We'd been saving for a down payment on a larger house, and while the unpaid leave would strain our budget, we could manage. I'd accrue enough vacation time to cover about 4 weeks of salary, and we'd adjust our expenses for the remaining time. "Are you nervous about telling them?" Tom asked one evening as I worked on my transition plans. "A little," I admitted. "But I've been with the company for 5 years. I've brought in millions of dollars in business. I've never missed a deadline or disappointed a client. They should be grateful to have me coming back." I practiced the conversation in my head, anticipating questions about my timeline, my plans for returning to work, and how we'd handle my responsibilities during my absence. I prepared answers that emphasized my commitment to the company and my desire to ensure a smooth transition. The night before the meeting, I organized all my materials in a folder: the transition plan, the client handover documents, a proposed timeline for my leave, and a copy of the company's own maternity leave policy. I dressed carefully in my best suit, wanting to project competence and professionalism. "You've got this," Tom said, kissing me goodbye. "They're lucky to have you." I walked into the office that morning feeling confident and prepared. I'd done everything right, covered every detail, anticipated every concern. I was ready to have a productive conversation about how we'd handle my leave while maintaining the high standards I'd established. I scheduled the meeting with Karen Walsh, the HR director, for 10 a.m. I'd worked with Karen on various employee matters over the years: performance reviews, team building initiatives, policy clarifications. She was always professional, if a bit formal. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes, which seemed like plenty of time to discuss the details and get everything documented properly. Had no idea that 30 minutes would change my life forever. Corinne's office was exactly what you'd expect from an HR director, neutral beige walls, motivational posters about teamwork, and a desk covered in neat stacks of paperwork. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, the same chair where I'd received my promotion announcements and performance reviews. "So, Sarah, what can I do for you today?" she asked, not looking up from her computer screen. "I wanted to discuss my maternity leave," I said, pulling out my prepared folder. "I'm about 3 months pregnant, and I'd like to go over the timeline and transition planning." That's when she looked up, her expression shifting from professional disinterest to something I couldn't quite read. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. "Maternity leave," she repeated as if the words tasted bitter. "I see." "Yes, I've prepared a comprehensive transition plan," I continued, opening my folder. "I've outlined how we can handle my current projects, and I've identified team members who can take over specific responsibilities. The Peterson Hotels campaign is structured so that—" "Sarah," Corinne interrupted, her tone sharp. "Let me stop you right there." I looked up, surprised by her brusque manner. This wasn't the collaborative discussion I'd expected. Pregnancy changes things," she said, her voice taking on a condescending tone. "Your priorities shift, your focus changes. You're not going to be the same employee you were before." "I don't understand," I said, my folder still open on my lap. "I'm planning to return to work after my leave. I've been with the company for 5 years, and I've consistently exceeded expectations. That's before," Karen said, waving her hand dismissively. "This is now. You're going to be a mother. That's a full-time job in itself." Heat rose in my cheeks. "Karen, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of managing both work and motherhood. Lots of women do it successfully." She laughed. Actually laughed, and the sound sent chills down my spine. "Oh, honey, that's what they all say. But then reality hits. The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the guilt of leaving your baby with strangers. You'll be distracted, emotional, unreliable." "That's not fair," I said, my voice rising. "You can't make assumptions about my performance based on my pregnancy. That's illegal." Corinne's expression hardened. "I'm not making assumptions. I'm speaking from experience. I've seen it happen dozens of times. High-performing women who think they can have it all, then realize they can't give 100% to both work and family." She stood up and walked around her desk, positioning herself between me and the door. "Look, Sarah, I'm trying to do you a favor here. This job is demanding. The travel, the long hours, the client pressures, that's not compatible with being a good mother. Maybe you should find a new job that's more compatible with your new priorities." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, and my hand instinctively moved to my stomach. "Are you seriously suggesting I quit because I'm pregnant?" "I'm suggesting you think realistically about your future," Karen said, her voice cold and calculated. "We need people who can be fully committed to their work. People who don't have divided loyalties. Divided loyalties." I repeated, incredulous. "Karen, I've brought in over $50 million in business for this company. I've worked weekends, holidays, and vacations. I've never missed a deadline or lost a client. How is that divided loyalty?" "That was before," she said again, as if my 5 years of dedication had been erased the moment I got pregnant. "Things change. Priorities change. And frankly, we can't afford to have someone in your position who isn't fully committed." I stared at her, barely able to process what I was hearing. This was the same company that had promoted me, praised my work, and relied on my expertise. Now they were suggesting I was incompetent because I was having a baby. "This is discrimination," I sighed, my voice shaking. "You can't treat me differently because I'm pregnant. It's against the law." Corinne's smile was cold and calculating. I'm not discriminating against you, Sarah. I'm having a frank conversation about career expectations. No one's forcing you to do anything, but you should think carefully about whether this is the right environment for someone in your situation. She opened my personnel file and made a note. I'll document that we discussed your changing priorities and the challenges of balancing work and family responsibilities. Don't you dare put that in my file, I said, standing up. I never said my priorities were changing. I said I was planning to take maternity leave, which is my legal right. Well, we'll see how you feel after the baby comes, Corinne said, closing the file. In the meantime, I'll start thinking about how to restructure your responsibilities. We need to make sure we have coverage for someone who might not be as available as before. I gathered my papers with shaking hands, my carefully prepared transition plan now seeming naive and pointless. This wasn't about planning for my leave, this was about pushing me out. This conversation isn't over, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Kern shrugged. Think about what I said, Sarah. Think about what's really best for your family. I walked out of her office in a daze, my legs unsteady. In the hallway, I passed colleagues who smiled and said good morning, oblivious to the fact that my world had just been turned upside down. I made it to my office and closed the door, then sat in my chair and stared at the wall of achievements I'd built over 5 years. Every award, every client thank you letter, every recognition of my hard work, none of it mattered anymore because I was going to be a mother and apparently that made me expendable. I sat in my office for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking and I felt nauseous in a way that had nothing to do with morning sickness. Every time I tried to focus on work, Karen's words echoed in my mind. Maybe you should find a new job that's more compatible with your new priorities. I picked up my phone to call Tom, then put it down. What would I even say? How could I explain that the company I'd devoted 5 years of my life to had just told me I was no longer wanted because I was pregnant? Finally, I grabbed my purse and left the office, mumbling something to my assistant about a client meeting. I needed to get out of there before I fell apart completely. The drive home was a blur of tears and traffic. I kept replaying the conversation, wondering if I'd misunderstood. If maybe Karen hadn't meant what I thought she meant, but there was no misinterpreting her words or her tone. She'd made it clear that my pregnancy made me a liability, not an asset. I pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to compose myself. Tom's truck was there. He'd been working from home that day, designing plans for a new office building. I didn't want to burden him with this, but I couldn't hide it either. He was in his home office when I walked in, architectural drawings spread across his desk. He looked up with a smile that immediately faded when he saw my face. Sarah, what's wrong? Is the baby okay? The baby's fine, I said, and then I started crying. Not the gentle tears of pregnancy hormones, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed. Tom was beside me in seconds, pulling me into his arms. What happened? Talk to me. Between sobs, I told him about the meeting with Corinne, about her suggestions that I find a new job, about the way she dismissed my 5 years of dedication as if it meant nothing. She said, what? Tom's voice was dangerous, the protective anger. I'd seen only a few times in our relationship. She can't say that. That's illegal. I know it's illegal, I said, wiping my eyes, but she was careful about how she said it. She made it sound like friendly advice, like she was doing me a favor. We sat on the couch and Tom held me while I cried. He didn't try to fix it or offer solutions, he just let me fall apart. I worked so hard, I whispered. I gave them everything. I missed family dinners, canceled vacations, worked weekends. I brought in millions of dollars for that company. And the moment I need something from them, they tell me I'm not committed enough. "You're the most committed person I know," Tom said, his voice fierce. "You've worked harder than anyone in that company. They're idiots if they can't see that." I pulled out my phone and showed him the text messages I'd been sending myself throughout the day, documenting the conversation with Karen. It was a habit I developed in my marketing work. Always keep records of important conversations. "I can't believe I'm saying this," I said, "but I think I need to talk to a lawyer." Tom nodded. "We'll find the best employment attorney in Chicago." "This isn't right, Sarah. They can't treat you like this." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the female colleagues who'd left the company over the years. Jessica from accounting, who'd quit after her second baby. Maria from business development, who'd taken a voluntary demotion after her maternity leave. Linda from client services, who'd resigned after being passed over for a promotion following her pregnancy. I'd always assumed they'd made personal choices to prioritize family over career. Now I wondered if they'd faced the same pressure I was facing, the same subtle but unmistakable message that mothers weren't welcome in the upper ranks. At 3 a.m., I got up and started researching employment law on my laptop. I read about pregnancy discrimination, about the rights guaranteed under the Family and Medical Leave Act, about successful lawsuits against companies that had treated pregnant employees unfairly. The more I read, the angrier I became. What had happened to me wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. And if it was happening to me, it was probably happening to other women too. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to quietly disappear like the others. I wasn't going to let Corinne and the company get away with this. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But first, I needed to document everything. Every conversation, every email, every subtle slight. I was going to build a case so strong that they'd have no choice but to acknowledge what they'd done. I was going to make them pay for underestimating me, because the one thing they'd forgotten about me was that I was very, very good at my job, and my job was about strategy, planning, and achieving goals against all odds. They just made themselves my biggest project. I threw myself into research the way I'd once thrown myself into marketing campaigns. My dining room table became a command center covered with legal documents, printed articles, and color-coded notebooks. If I was going to fight this, I needed to understand every angle. The Family and Medical Leave Act was crystal clear. Eligible employees were entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave for the birth of a child, with job protection and continued health benefits. Employers couldn't retaliate against employees for taking FMLA leave or for requesting it. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was even more specific, treating women unfavorably because of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions was illegal. Employers couldn't fire, refuse to hire, or discriminate in terms of employment because of pregnancy. I printed out case studies highlighting successful lawsuits against companies that had engaged in pregnancy discrimination. A financial services firm in New York had paid $2.2 million to settle a class action lawsuit. A tech company in California had been forced to reinstate a pregnant employee and pay damages after firing her for requesting maternity leave. But I also read about the failures cases where women had been unable to prove discrimination, where companies had successfully argued that employment decisions were based on performance rather than pregnancy. The burden of proof was always on the employee, and companies had become skilled at disguising discrimination behind legitimate-sounding business reasons. I needed to understand the patterns, the warning signs, the ways companies tried to push out pregnant employees without openly violating the law. I made notes on phrases that appeared repeatedly in court documents: changing priorities, lack of commitment, family obligations, divided attention. Corinne had used almost identical language. I researched employment attorneys in Chicago, reading their websites, their case histories, their success rates. I wanted someone who specialized in pregnancy discrimination, someone who understood the subtle ways companies tried to circumvent the law. The Illinois Department of Human Rights had filed complaints against dozens of companies for pregnancy discrimination. I read through public records, looking for patterns, for companies that had been repeat offenders. I was shocked to discover that Meridian Corporation had been investigated twice in the past. 8 years for discriminatory practices, once for age discrimination in 2016, and once for gender discrimination in 2019. Both cases had been settled out of court with undisclosed terms. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. I started keeping a detailed journal, documenting every interaction at work, every meeting, every conversation. I noted the date, time, location, and people present. I recorded exact quotes whenever possible, and I backed up my notes with email confirmations and calendar entries. I researched Meridian's executive team, looking for connections, for potential allies, for people who might have influence over HR decisions. I studied their public statements about diversity and inclusion, their corporate values, their marketing materials that promoted family-friendly policies. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using my marketing research skills to build a case against my own company. Late one night, I found an academic study about pregnancy discrimination in corporate America. The statistics were staggering. 88% of women reported experiencing some form of pregnancy-related discrimination, but only 3% filed formal complaints. Most women either quit or accepted reduced responsibilities rather than fight. I understood why. Fighting meant exposing yourself to retaliation, to legal costs, to the stress of litigation while dealing with pregnancy and new motherhood. It meant risking your career, your reputation, your future job prospects. But I also understood something else. If women like me didn't fight, nothing would change. The Karens of the world would continue to push out pregnant employees, confident that their victims would quietly disappear. I'd spent 5 years building campaigns that changed consumer behavior, that shifted market perceptions, that achieved seemingly impossible goals. Now I was going to build a campaign that would change my company's behavior, was going to make them understand that discriminating against pregnant women had consequences, real consequences. As I dug deeper into my research, I realized I needed to understand whether other women at Meridian had faced similar treatment. I started with the company directory, going through names and mentally cataloging the women who'd left over the past 5 years. Jessica Martinez had been a rising star in accounting before she had twins. She'd returned from maternity leave to find her responsibilities significantly reduced and her access to important meetings restricted. She'd resigned 6 months later, citing family priorities. But I remembered her tears at her farewell lunch. How she'd said it wasn't her choice. Maria Santos, from business development, had been instrumental in landing the Hartwell Group contract worth $8 million. After her maternity leave, she'd been moved to a support role with no client contact. She'd taken a voluntary demotion, accepting a 30% pay cut to work part-time. She'd left the company entirely within a year. Linda Chun from client services had been passed over for a promotion to senior director after returning from maternity leave. The position had gone to a male colleague with less experience. Linda had filed an internal complaint, but nothing had come of it. She'd eventually left to start her own consulting firm. The pattern was becoming clear. High-performing women would take maternity leave, return to find their roles diminished, their responsibilities reduced, their career trajectories derailed. They'd either accept the demotion or leave entirely. I started reaching out to former colleagues, being careful to frame my inquiries as friendly catch-ups rather than formal interviews. I didn't want to create a paper trail that might get back to HR. I called Jessica first, finding her number through LinkedIn. She was working part-time at a small accounting firm, making about half what she'd earned at Meridian. "Sarah, how are you? I heard through the grapevine that you're expecting congratulations." Thank you. Actually, that's sort of why I'm calling. I'm trying to understand what to expect when I come back from maternity leave. I remember you saying it was challenging to balance everything. There was a long pause. Sarah, can I ask why you're really calling? I took a deep breath. I had a meeting with Corinne Walsh about my maternity leave. It didn't go well. Oh, God, Jessica said. What did she say? I told her about Corinne's suggestions that I find a new job, about the implications that I wouldn't be committed enough to do my job effectively. She said almost the exact same thing to me, Jessica said quietly. She told me that I needed to reconsider my priorities and that the company needed people who could be fully present when I came back from leave. They'd restructured my entire department. Suddenly, I was handling basic bookkeeping instead of financial analysis. Did you ever think about filing a complaint? I thought about it, Jessica said, but I had two babies at home and I couldn't afford to lose my job entirely. It seemed easier to just accept the situation and move on. My conversation with Maria was similarly illuminating. She'd been told that client-facing roles weren't appropriate for someone with family obligations. Her manager had suggested that she'd be happier in a support role where she wouldn't have to travel or work late hours. I kept telling them I was willing to travel, that I had excellent childcare arranged, Maria said, that they'd already made up their minds. They saw me as a liability, not an asset. Linda's story was the most disturbing. She'd been explicitly told that her pregnancy showed poor judgment and lack of planning. Her manager had questioned whether she was serious about her career and had suggested that she might be happier at a more family-friendly company. I should have fought harder, Linda said. But I was so tired and I just wanted to focus on my family. I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for that level of responsibility anymore. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Talented women who'd been systematically marginalized after becoming mothers. They'd been pushed out through subtle but unmistakable pressure, their careers derailed not by their own choices but by discriminatory treatment. I started mapping out the organizational structure, identifying which managers and executives had been involved in these decisions. Corinne Walsh was central to all of them, but she hadn't acted alone. Department heads, senior managers, and even the C-suite had been complicit in the systematic discrimination. I also noticed something else. The women who'd been pushed out had all been high performers, people who'd threatened the status quo or challenged the old boys network. They'd been seen as competition, not colleagues. The realization was both infuriating and empowering. This wasn't about my individual case. This was about a systemic problem that had been allowed to persist for years. The company had been violating federal law with impunity, confident that their victims would quietly disappear. But I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I was going to expose the pattern, document the systematic discrimination, and hold everyone involved accountable. Because what they'd done to me, Jessica, Maria, Linda, and countless others wasn't just illegal, it was morally reprehensible, and I was going to make sure the world knew about it. Finding allies within the company was more challenging than reaching out to former employees. I needed to be careful, too obvious, and word would get back to Curran. Too subtle, and I might miss potential supporters who could help build my case. I started with Jennifer Rodriguez from accounting, someone I'd worked with on budget analyses for major campaigns. She was a few years older than me, married with no children, and had always struck me as someone who paid attention to office dynamics. I found her in the break room one Tuesday afternoon, and after some casual conversation about quarterly reports, I carefully broached the subject. Jennifer, can I ask you something confidential? Have you ever noticed any patterns with how pregnant employees are treated here? She glanced around to make sure we were alone, then lowered her voice. Why are you asking? I told her about my meeting with Corinne, watching her expression change from curiosity to concern to anger. That's exactly what happened to Jessica, she said. I tried to warn her, but she thought I was being paranoid. When she came back from maternity leave, they'd given half her responsibilities to the new guy they hired while she was gone. You tried to warn her? Jennifer nodded. I've been here 8 years. I've seen this happen over and over. They find ways to push out women who have babies. They're very careful about it, nothing obvious, nothing that would be easy to prove in court. She agreed to meet me for coffee that weekend, away from the office, over lattes at a cafe in Lincoln Park. She told me about conversations she'd overheard, comments made in meetings when pregnant employees weren't present. David Chen once said that hiring women of childbearing age was risky because they might disappear for months and leave projects hanging, Jennifer said. He didn't know I was listening, but I was taking notes in the corner during the budget meeting. She'd kept informal notes over the years, documenting comments and incidents that troubled her. Nothing official, just personal observations, but they painted a disturbing picture of systematic bias. Why didn't you ever report any of this? I asked. Report it to who? Karen Walsh. She's part of the problem. Report it to David. He made half the comments. The whole system is designed to protect itself. Jennifer introduced me to 2 other women who'd noticed the pattern. Amanda from marketing communications and Rachel from project management. Both had children and had experienced their own challenges, though neither had faced the direct pressure I was dealing with. They were more subtle with me, Amanda said when we met for lunch. After I came back from maternity leave, I was suddenly excluded from strategic planning meetings. My manager said they didn't want to overwhelm me with additional responsibilities, but those meetings were where decisions got made, where opportunities emerged. Rachel's experience was similar. They moved me to a different team while I was on leave, claiming it was a better fit for my skills. The new team handled smaller projects with less visibility. It was a demotion disguised as a lateral move. The 4 of us started meeting regularly, sharing observations and documenting incidents. We created a private email chain using our personal accounts, careful to never discuss our concerns on company systems. Amanda suggested we reach out to other current employees who might have information. There are probably women throughout the company who've seen things, who've been affected but were afraid to speak up. We were careful about our approach, testing the waters with casual conversations before revealing our true purpose. To our surprise, we found more allies than expected. Deborah from legal had noticed that pregnancy discrimination complaints were consistently dismissed without proper investigation. I've raised concerns about our procedures, but I was told to focus on my own responsibilities, she said. Marcus from IT, whose wife had faced discrimination at another company, offered to help us securely document our evidence. I know how to set up encrypted communications and secure file storage, he said. If you're building a case, you need to protect your information. Even some of the men in the company were willing to speak up. James from business development had witnessed Corinne's comments about pregnant employees being unreliable. Robert from finance had seen budget discussions where maternity leave costs were described as burdens rather than legal obligations. What emerged was a network of employees who'd been disturbed by what they'd witnessed, but had felt powerless to act. Individually, together, we represented a significant portion of the workforce, people at various levels who could provide testimony about the company's discriminatory culture. We established ground rules for our group. Everything discussed was confidential. No one was obligated to participate beyond their comfort level, and we would protect each other from retaliation as much as possible. Most importantly, we agreed that this wasn't just about my case. It was about changing the culture for future employees. We were building something bigger than individual grievances. We were building a movement for change. The company had underestimated us, assuming that isolated employees would be too intimidated or too focused on their own careers to band together. They were wrong. We were stronger together than any of us could be alone, and we were just getting started. After weeks of research and building my network of allies, I knew I needed professional legal advice. I compiled a list of employment attorneys who specialized in pregnancy discrimination, and after reading reviews and case histories, I settled on Maria Rodriguez from the firm Carter. Rodriguez and Associates. Her office was in a gleaming downtown high-rise, and her credentials were impressive. Harvard Law School, 15 years specializing in employment discrimination, numerous successful cases against major corporations. More importantly, her website featured testimonials from women who'd faced situations similar to mine. I was nervous walking into her office, carrying a thick folder of documentation I'd assembled over the past month. Maria was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with kind eyes and a confident demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Tell me what happened," she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her desk. I walked her through the timeline, my pregnancy announcement, the meeting with Curran Walsh, the discriminatory comments, and the pattern I discovered among other female employees. She took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Did Corinne put any of her comments in writing?" Maria asked. "No, she was careful about that. But I documented everything immediately after the meeting, including exact quotes and timestamps." "Good. That's admissible evidence. Tell me about your work performance prior to the pregnancy." I pulled out my performance reviews, promotion letters, and client testimonials. Maria reviewed them carefully, occasionally raising her eyebrows at particularly strong endorsements of my work. "This is excellent documentation," she said. "You've been a model employee by every objective measure. Any reasonable person would conclude that pregnancy was the only factor that changed their attitude toward you." She asked about witnesses to Corinne's comments, about other employees who could testify to the discriminatory culture, about any written policies that might contradict the company's actions. "What you're describing is a textbook case of pregnancy discrimination," Maria said. "The question isn't whether you have a case, you absolutely do. The question is what outcome you're hoping to achieve." I thought about this extensively. I want 3 things. I want to be able to take my maternity leave without fear of retaliation. I want the company to change their policies and culture so this doesn't happen to other women. And I want accountability for what they've done. Those are all achievable goals, Maria said. "Let's talk about the process. You have several options. You can file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You can file a complaint with the Illinois Department of Human Rights, or you can pursue litigation directly. I'd recommend starting with the EEOC. It's required before you can file a lawsuit, and it sends a strong message to your employer." She explained the timeline. The EEOC investigation could take several months, during which the company would be required to respond to the allegations and provide their own documentation. If the EEOC found probable cause, they might attempt to mediate a settlement. If not, they'd issue a right to sue letter that would allow us to proceed with litigation. "What about retaliation?" I asked. "I'm worried they'll find ways to make my life miserable or fire me for filing a complaint." "Retaliation is illegal and would only strengthen your case," Maria said. "Companies know this, so most are careful not to engage in obvious retaliatory behavior. But if they do, we'll document it and add it to your complaint." She quoted her fees, a contingency arrangement where she'd take a percentage of any settlement or judgment, plus expenses. It was expensive, but I wouldn't have to pay unless we won. "I need to ask you a difficult question," Maria said. "Are you prepared for the stress of this process?" Pregnancy discrimination cases can be emotionally draining, especially when you're actually pregnant. The company will probably hire aggressive attorneys who'll try to discredit you and your motives. I thought about Jessica, Maria, Linda, and all the other women who'd been pushed out without a fight. I thought about my daughter. Yes, we'd found out it was a girl, and the workplace she might inherit. I'm prepared, I said. This isn't just about me anymore, Maria smiled. Good, because with documentation like this and the pattern of behavior you've uncovered, we have a strong chance of not just winning, but creating real change. She gave me her business card and a detailed timeline of what to expect. Don't sign anything from the company without consulting me first. Don't have any unrecorded conversations with HR, and keep documenting everything, every email, every meeting, every interaction. Walking back to my car, I felt a mixture of relief and determination. I wasn't alone anymore. I had a skilled advocate who understood the law, who believed in my case, and who was willing to fight alongside me. The company had made a mistake when they assumed I'd quietly accept their discrimination. They were about to learn just how big a mistake that was. Following Maria's advice, I became meticulous about documentation. Every interaction, every email, every casual conversation that touched on my pregnancy or work responsibilities was recorded in a secure digital journal I kept on my personal laptop. My performance review file became a crucial piece of evidence. 5 years of exceeds expectations ratings, with comments like, Sarah consistently delivers exceptional results, invaluable team member, and demonstrates remarkable leadership skills. My promotion letters documented steady advancement and increasing responsibilities. The most recent review, completed just 2 months before I'd announced my pregnancy, was particularly damning for the company's case. David Chun had written, Sarah is one of our most valuable assets. Her strategic thinking and client relationship skills are unmatched. I recommend her for promotion to senior director at the earliest opportunity. 2 months later, Curran was suggesting I find a new job. I printed and organized every piece of positive feedback. I'd received client testimonials praising my work, emails from colleagues thanking me for my contributions, internal memos recognizing my achievements. The Peterson Hotels campaign alone had generated dozens of laudatory messages from senior management. The financial documentation was equally compelling. I calculated that my campaigns had brought in over $58 million in revenue during my 5 years with the company. My salary represented less than 2% of the value I generated, a remarkable return on investment by any measure. I documented the company's own policies, printing the employee handbook sections on family leave, equal opportunity employment, and anti-discrimination procedures. Their written policies were exemplary, full of language about supporting work-life balance and creating an inclusive environment. The reality, as I was learning, was quite different. I collected evidence of the pattern I'd discovered among other female employees. Using LinkedIn and public records, I documented the career trajectories of women who'd left after having children. The statistics were stark. Over the past 5 years, 73% of women who'd taken maternity leave had either left the company or been demoted within 18 months of returning. By contrast, male employees who'd taken family leave, admittedly, a much smaller sample size, had continued advancing at normal rates. I created a timeline of discriminatory incidents reported by my allies, cross-referencing them with personnel changes and policy decisions. The pattern was clear and consistent. Pregnancy or motherhood led to marginalization and eventual departure. Email communications were trickier to document since the company controlled the servers, but I carefully saved messages that related to my work performance and responsibilities. I was particularly careful to document any changes in how I was being treated following my pregnancy. Announcement. The most challenging aspect was documenting verbal conversations. Following Maria's advice, I started confirming discussions with follow-up emails. Thank you for meeting with me today. To confirm my understanding, you said that my responsibilities for the Peterson Hotels campaign would be transferred to Michael beginning next month. Please let me know if I've misunderstood anything. Most managers responded to these emails, inadvertently creating written records of conversations. They'd prefer to keep verbal. I organized everything in a secure filing system, both physical and digital. Each document was labeled with dates, participants, and relevance to the case. I created multiple backup copies, storing them in different locations to ensure nothing could be lost or destroyed. The picture that emerged was devastating for Meridian Corporation. Here was an employee with stellar performance reviews, documented achievements, and proven value to the company, being subjected to discriminatory treatment solely because of her pregnancy. But the documentation process was taking an emotional toll. Reviewing 5 years of achievement only to see it dismissed because of my pregnancy was infuriating. Reading through the stories of other women who'd faced similar treatment was heartbreaking. Tom found me crying one evening over my laptop, scrolling through performance reviews that now seemed meaningless. "You're building something important," he said, sitting beside me. "All of this documentation, it's going to help not just you, but every woman who comes after you." He was right. I wasn't just documenting my case, I was building a historical record of systematic discrimination. Future women wouldn't have to wonder whether they were imagining the bias they faced. The evidence would be clear and undeniable. I finished organizing the last of my documentation on a Sunday evening, creating a comprehensive file that told the story of my career, my value to the company, and the discrimination I'd faced. It was thorough, professional, and damning. I was ready to file my complaint. The company thought they could quietly push me out, relying on my silence and compliance. They had no idea what was coming. The subtle retaliation began almost immediately after my meeting with Corinne, though it took me a few days to recognize the pattern. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, reading discrimination into normal workplace dynamics. But as the incidents accumulated, the intent became undeniable. It started with meetings. The weekly strategy sessions I'd attended for 3 years suddenly became optional for me. When I showed up anyway, there were barely disguised looks of annoyance from David, Chun, and other senior managers. Important decisions were being made in these meetings, decisions that affected my projects and my team. "We didn't want to burden you with additional responsibilities," David said when I questioned my exclusion. "We know you have other priorities now." Other priorities? The phrase had become code for my pregnancy, a way to marginalize me without explicitly mentioning my condition. The Peterson Hotels campaign. My biggest success was slowly being transferred away from me. First, Michael was brought in as additional support. Then he was given direct client contact. Finally, I received a memo informing me that he would be taking the lead while I provided strategic oversight. Strategic oversight. Another euphemism for being pushed aside. My assistant, Jennifer Kim, who'd been working with me for 2 years, was reassigned to support the business development team. When I asked Corinne about getting a replacement, she said the department was restructuring and that I'd need to manage my workload more efficiently. The office space changes were more subtle but equally demoralizing. My corner office, which I'd earned through 5 years of exemplary performance, was needed for collaborative workspace restructuring. I was moved to a smaller office in a less desirable location next to the copy machine and the break room. "It's temporary," Karen assured me, though she couldn't provide a timeline for when I might move back. Travel opportunities, which had once been routine for my position, suddenly became unavailable. When the Riverside Hotels chain requested a presentation in Boston, David assigned it to Michael instead of me. "We thought you'd prefer to stay local," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Given your condition, my condition." Another way to avoid saying the word pregnant while making it clear that my Pregnancy was the reason for my professional isolation. The most frustrating part was how carefully orchestrated it all was. Every decision had a plausible business justification. Every exclusion was framed as consideration for my well-being. Every demotion was disguised as restructuring or efficiency, but the message was clear. Pregnant women weren't welcome in positions of authority or responsibility. My team members began treating me differently too, though I suspected they'd been given guidance from management. The easy camaraderie we'd developed over years of working together was replaced by awkward formality. People who'd once sought my input on projects now went directly to Michael or David. I documented everything meticulously, sending follow-up emails that created written records of verbal discussions, saving copies of memos that reassigned my responsibilities, and maintaining detailed notes about meetings and conversations. One particularly egregious incident occurred during the monthly department meeting. David was discussing upcoming projects and team assignments, systematically excluding me from anything significant. "What about the Hartwell Group renewal?" I asked. "I've managed that relationship for 3 years. We're considering bringing in fresh perspective," David said. "Michael will be taking the lead on that one too. Fresh perspective." The client relationship I'd built from scratch, worth $12 million annually, was being handed to someone else because I was pregnant. After the meeting, I approached David privately. "I need to understand why my responsibilities are being redistributed. My performance hasn't changed, and I haven't requested any modifications to my workload." "Sarah, we're just trying to be considerate of your situation," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Pregnancy is a challenging time, and we want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." "I haven't indicated that I'm overwhelmed. In fact, I've consistently requested to maintain my full responsibilities." "Well, that's admirable," David said with a patronizing smile. "But we have to think about what's best for the company and for you. These transitions take time to implement properly." The conversation was a masterclass in discriminatory doublespeak. Every statement could be defended as concern for my well-being, but the cumulative effect was to systematically strip away everything that made my job meaningful and challenging. I left the office that day feeling completely demoralized. 5 years of building relationships, developing expertise, and proving my value, and it can all be taken away because I was having a baby. But I also felt something else: determination. They thought they could pressure me into quitting, into making their discrimination problem disappear quietly. They thought they could isolate me professionally and personally until I gave up and walked away. They were wrong. Every slight, every exclusion, every patronizing comment was being documented and would become evidence in my case. They weren't just discriminating against me. They were building my legal claim with every decision they made. They'd underestimated me before, and they were underestimating me now. That was going to be their biggest mistake. By my 6th month of pregnancy, the discrimination had escalated to the point where I dreaded going to work each day. What had once been my sanctuary, the place where I felt most confident and accomplished, had become a hostile environment designed to push me out. The final straw came during what should have been a routine client meeting. The Riverside Hotel's executives were visiting Chicago to discuss expanding their marketing campaign, and I'd been managing this relationship for 4 years. I knew every detail of their business, every preference of their executive team, every nuance of their brand positioning. But when I arrived at the conference room, I found Michael presenting my strategic recommendations to the client. "Sarah, glad you could join us," David said without looking up from his notes. Michael was just walking everyone through the Q4 campaign strategy. My strategy. The one I'd spent weeks developing, the one that incorporated market research I'd personally conducted and creative concepts I'd brainstormed with my team. Sat in stunned silence as Michael presented my work as his own, using my slides, my analysis, my ideas. The client executives who'd worked with me for years looked confused by my relegated position at the table. Sarah always had such innovative ideas for our campaigns, said Jennifer Walsh, Riverside's marketing director. We were hoping to hear her thoughts on the new direction. Oh, Sarah's been providing strategic oversight, David said smoothly. Michael's been handling the day-to-day implementation. We wanted to make sure Sarah wasn't overwhelmed with details. The humiliation was complete. In front of a client I'd nurtured for years, I'd been reduced to a figurehead while someone else took credit for my work. After the meeting, I locked myself in my office and cried. Not the gentle tears of pregnancy hormones, but the desperate sobs of someone whose professional identity was being systematically destroyed. I found myself drafting a resignation letter, my hands shaking as I typed. Maybe they were right. Maybe I couldn't handle the demands of my job while pregnant. Maybe it would be easier to just walk away, to find something less challenging, less stressful. Dear David, I wrote, please accept this letter as my formal resignation from my position as marketing director. My last day of employment will be... I stared at the words on my screen, feeling like a failure. All those years of education, of building my career, of proving myself in a competitive industry. And I was ready to throw it all away because a group of small-minded people couldn't see past my pregnancy. Then I felt her kicked up my daughter hour. Daughter moved inside me, a strong, determined flutter that seemed to say, don't give up, Mom. I thought about the conversation Tom and I had had the night before. He'd found me researching part-time positions, looking for family-friendly companies that might be more understanding of working mothers. You're not the problem here, he'd said, closing my laptop and taking my hands. You're not too ambitious, too demanding, or too anything. They're discriminating against you, and that's illegal. I thought about Jessica, Maria, Linda, and all the other women who'd been quietly pushed out. They'd probably sat in their offices writing similar resignation letters, feeling like they'd failed when the real failure was the system that forced them to choose. I thought about my daughter's future, about the workplace she might inherit. Did I want her to grow up in a world where pregnancy was treated as a professional liability? Where women had to choose between having children and having careers? I deleted the resignation letter instead. I opened a new document and began writing something else entirely, a detailed summary of every discriminatory incident I'd experienced. Every exclusion, every slight, every patronizing comment disguised as concern. I picked up my phone and called Maria Rodriguez. I'm ready to file the complaint, I said when she answered. What changed your mind? I looked up the ultrasound photo taped to my computer monitor at my daughter's perfect profile captured in grainy black and white. I realized I'm not just fighting for myself anymore, I said. I'm fighting for her future. Good, Maria said. Because we're going to win this thing. I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had in months. The humiliation, the anger, the frustration, it was all still there, but it was channeled now, focused into something productive and powerful. They'd push me to my breaking point, assuming I'd break. Instead, I'd found my strength. The little girl inside me had reminded me who I really was. Not a victim, not someone who ran from fights, but someone who stood up for what was right. It was time to show them what I was really capable of. The real fight was just beginning. Filing the EEOC complaint was both terrifying and liberating. Maria and I spent hours crafting the document, ensuring every incident was accurately described, every date was precise, every claim was supported by evidence. The complaint was comprehensive. Pregnancy discrimination under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, violations of the Family and Medical Leave Act, retaliation for asserting my rights and creating a hostile work environment. We documented the systematic pattern of discrimination, not just against me, but against other female employees who'd become mothers. This is one of the strongest complaints I filed, Maria said as we reviewed the final draft. The documentation is thorough, the pattern is clear, and the retaliation is well documented. I signed the complaint on a Tuesday morning, my hand steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. With that signature, I was officially challenging one of Chicago's largest hospitality management companies, accusing them of systematic discrimination and illegal retaliation. Maria filed the complaint electronically that afternoon. Within hours, Meridian Corporation would receive notification that they were under federal investigation for employment discrimination. The company's response was swift and predictable. I was called into David Chen's office the next morning, where I found him sitting with Kern Walsh and a man I didn't recognize clearly a lawyer based on his expensive suit and briefcase. "Sarah, I think you know why we've asked you to meet with us," David said, his tone carefully neutral. "I assume you've received the EEOC complaint," I replied, matching his professional demeanor. "This is very disappointing," Corinne said, shaking her head. "We've tried to be supportive during your pregnancy, and this is how you repay our consideration." The lawyer introduced himself as Richard Morrison from Blackstone and Associates, the company's employment law firm. "Ms. Mitchell, we're prepared to discuss this matter with you and your counsel. These complaints often arise from misunderstandings that can be resolved through dialogue." "There's no misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I've been subjected to discriminatory treatment because of my pregnancy, and I've documented every incident." "That's a serious allegation," Morrison said. "The company disputes your characterization of these events. What you're describing as discrimination, we view as reasonable business decisions and efforts to accommodate your changing needs." Reasonable business decisions? I couldn't hide my incredulity, stripping away my responsibilities, excluding me from meetings, transferring my projects to male colleagues. These are accommodations? "We were trying to reduce your stress level," David interjected. "Pregnancy can be overwhelming, and we wanted to ensure you weren't overextended." I never requested accommodations. I never indicated that I was overwhelmed. In fact, I repeatedly asked to maintain my full responsibilities. The meeting continued for 30 minutes, with Morrison trying to convince me to withdraw the complaint. In exchange for vague promises of renewed dialogue and mutually beneficial solutions, I declined, stating that any discussions would need to include my attorney. Word of the complaint spread through the office within days. Though the company tried to keep it quiet, some colleagues avoided me entirely, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Others, particularly the women in my informal network, offered quiet support through knowing glances and brief encouraging words. Jennifer Rodriguez stopped by my office the day after the meeting with Morrison. "I heard about the complaint," she said, closing the door behind her. "Good for you. Are you worried about retaliation?" I asked. "Probably should be," she said with a wry smile. "But I'm tired of watching good women get pushed out. If you need me to testify, I will." The EEOC investigation began immediately. An investigator named Patricia Williams contacted me within a week, scheduling an interview to discuss my allegations in detail. She was professional and thorough, asking probing questions about each incident I documented. "How certain are you about the exact wording of Ms. Walsh's comments?" she asked. "Very certain." I wrote everything down immediately after our meeting and confirmed the details with follow-up emails. "And you have documentation of your performance prior to announcing your pregnancy?" I provided her with copies of my performance reviews, client testimonials, and revenue figures. She reviewed them carefully, occasionally making notes. "This level of documentation is unusual," she said. "Most complainants don't have such comprehensive records." "I've always been thorough in my work," I replied. "That didn't change when I became pregnant. The company was required to respond to the allegations within 30 days. Their response when it came was predictably defensive. They claimed all personnel decisions had been based on legitimate business reasons, denied any discriminatory intent, and portrayed their actions as efforts to accommodate my pregnancy. But the EEOC investigation was uncovering uncomfortable truths. Patricia Williams interviewed current and former employees, our EVIEWED personnel files, and examined the company's track record with pregnant employees. The pattern I'd identified was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 weeks after filing the complaint, I received an unexpected call from a reporter at the Chicago Tribune. Somehow word of the investigation had leaked, and she was working on a story about pregnancy discrimination in corporate America. "I understand you filed a complaint against Meridian Corporation," she said. "Would you be willing to discuss your experience?" I referred her to Maria, who advised caution. "Public attention can help your case, but it can also create additional pressure," she said. "Let's see how the investigation develops before we consider media involvement." The story ran anyway, without my participation. It was a brief mention in the business section, noting that Meridian was under federal investigation for alleged pregnancy discrimination. But it was public now, no longer a private matter between me and the company. The reaction at work was immediate and uncomfortable. David Chen called an emergency management meeting, and I could see through the conference room windows that it was heated. Afterward, several managers avoided eye contact with me in the hallways, but something else was happening too. Women throughout the company were reaching out, sharing their own experiences, offering support. The complaint had given them permission to speak up about incidents they'd witnessed or experienced themselves. Amanda from Marketing Communications forwarded me an email chain where several women discussed the investigation. Finally, one had written, "Someone with the courage to fight back." The EEOC investigation was gathering momentum, and the company was clearly feeling pressure. Their lawyers were demanding documents, interviewing witnesses, and digging into personnel practices that had gone unexamined for years. I realized that filing the complaint hadn't just started a legal process. It had started a conversation about equality, about women's rights in the workplace, about the price of staying silent in the face of discrimination. The company had expected me to quietly disappear, to accept their discrimination without challenge. Instead, I'd brought the full weight of federal law enforcement down on them, and we were just getting started. The EEOC investigation intensified over the following months, and Patricia Williams proved to be thorough and relentless. She interviewed dozens of current and former employees, subpoenaed personnel files going back 7 years, and examined every aspect of the company's treatment of pregnant employees and working mothers. What she found was devastating for Meridian Corporation. The statistics were damning. Over the past 5 years, 89% of women who'd taken maternity leave had either left the company or been demoted within 2 years of returning. Male employees who'd taken family leave showed no such pattern of departure or demotion. Even more telling were the performance evaluations. Women consistently received lower ratings immediately following their return from maternity leave, despite no documented changes in their work quality or output. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Patricia uncovered internal emails that the company probably thought had been deleted. In one exchange, David Chen had written to another manager, "We need to think carefully about promoting women who might disappear for months at a time. It's not fair to the rest of the team." In another email, Corinne Walsh had described maternity leave as an expensive burden that affects productivity and team morale. Most damaging was a message from the VP of Human Resources to department heads. Managers should consider the long-term reliability of employees when making project assignments. Family obligations can significantly impact availability and focus. The company's lawyers tried to argue that these communications were taken out of context, that they reflected legitimate business concerns rather than discriminatory intent. But the pattern was too clear, the language too revealing. More witnesses came forward as word of the investigation spread. Jessica Martinez agreed to be interviewed, sharing her experience of being marginalized after returning from maternity leave. Maria Santos provided detailed testimony about being pushed out of client-facing roles because of her family obligations. Even some male employees spoke up. James from business development confirmed that he'd witnessed discriminatory comments in management meetings. Robert from finance testified about budget discussions where maternity leave was consistently portrayed as a financial burden rather than a legal obligation. The investigation also revealed that my experience wasn't unique. In other ways, 2 other women had been subjected to similar pressure from Karen Walsh when they'd announced pregnancies. One had quit rather than face continued harassment. The other had suffered a miscarriage and never had to test the company's response to her maternity leave request. Patricia Williams was particularly interested in the company's response to my complaint. The fact that they'd immediately assigned a high-powered employment law firm suggested they knew their practices were problematic. Their initial offers to resolve the matter through dialogue indicated an awareness of legal vulnerability. 3 months into the investigation, Maria received a call from Richard Morrison, the company's attorney. "My clients are interested in discussing resolution," he said. "Perhaps we could arrange a mediation session." The company was feeling the pressure. The investigation was uncovering years of discriminatory practices, and they knew that a formal finding of discrimination could lead to significant financial penalties and court-ordered changes to their policies, but they'd underestimated how far I was willing to take this fight. "I'm not interested in a quiet settlement that makes this go away," I told Maria. "I want accountability, policy changes, and assurance that other women won't face what I've faced." "They may not be willing to agree to systemic changes," Maria warned. "Most companies prefer to settle individual cases without admitting wrongdoing." "Then we'll take it all the way," I said. "The evidence is overwhelming, and other women are counting on us to create real change." Patricia Williams seemed pleased with my determination when she called to update me on her findings. "This is one of the clearest cases of systematic pregnancy discrimination I've investigated," she said. "The documentation is extensive, the pattern is undeniable, and the witness testimony is compelling. What happens next?" "I'll be issuing my findings within the next few weeks. Based on what I've uncovered, I'll be recommending that the EEOC find reasonable cause to believe that discrimination occurred." A finding of reasonable cause would give us significant leverage in any settlement negotiations. It would also serve as a strong foundation for litigation if the company refused to agree to meaningful changes. The company's stock price had already begun to suffer. As news of the investigation spread through industry circles, their reputation as an employer was being questioned, and they were facing scrutiny from clients who valued diversity and inclusion. But most importantly, women throughout the company were beginning to speak up. The culture of silence that had allowed discrimination to flourish was breaking down. Women were documenting incidents, supporting each other, and demanding better treatment. The investigation had become more than just my individual case. It had become a catalyst for broader change. The company was discovering that discriminating against pregnant employees had consequences far beyond what they'd anticipated, and those consequences were just beginning. The EEOC's formal finding came on a crisp October morning when I was 8 months pregnant. Patricia Williams called personally to deliver the news. "We're issuing a finding of reasonable cause. The evidence of discrimination is overwhelming and undeniable." Within hours, Richard Morrison was on the phone with Maria, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss settlement terms. The company's confidence had evaporated in the face of the federal government's official determination that they had violated civil rights law. The mediation session was scheduled for the following week at a neutral location downtown. I waddled into the conference room, feeling both powerful and vulnerable. My pregnancy was now unmistakably visible, a constant reminder of what had started this entire fight. The company's team filled one side of the long table. Morrison and two other attorneys, David Chen, Karen Walsh, and a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as the new VP of Human Resources. Apparently, the investigation had already claimed at least one casualty. Our side was smaller but more focused. Maria, myself, and a representative from the EEOC who would observe the proceedings. Morrison opened with what he probably thought was a generous offer, my full salary through maternity leave, a guarantee that I could return to my position afterward, and a cash settlement of $50,000 in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement and dropping all claims. That's insulting, Maria responded immediately. Your client has engaged in systematic discrimination that affected not just my client, but numerous other employees. $50,000 doesn't begin to address the scope of the violations or the changes needed to prevent future discrimination. What are you looking for? Morrison asked, his tone suggesting he expected unreasonable demands. Maria slid a document across the table. Our demands were comprehensive but fair, a significant financial settlement that reflected both my economic losses and the emotional distress I'd endured. Reinstatement to my full responsibilities, mandatory training for all managers on pregnancy, discrimination, policy changes to protect future employees, and external monitoring to ensure compliance. We're also demanding the removal of Ms. Walsh from any role involving personnel decisions, Maria added. Her conduct throughout this process has been egregious and suggests she's incapable of managing employees without bias. Curran's face flushed, red, but she remained silent while Morrison reviewed our terms. These demands are excessive, he said finally. You're asking us to admit wrongdoing and pay punitive damages for what were legitimate business decisions? Legitimate business decisions? I spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Telling a pregnant employee to find a new job isn't a business decision. It's blatant discrimination. That's not what happened, Curran interjected, breaking her silence. I was offering career counseling. You were engaging in illegal discrimination. Maria cut her off. And the EEOC investigation has confirmed that pattern extended far beyond my client's case. The negotiations continued for hours, with the company's team periodically stepping out for private consultations. Their initial offer slowly increased, $75,000, then $100,000, then $150,000, but they resisted our demands for systemic changes, particularly the requirement for external monitoring and Karen's removal from personnel decisions. We can agree to enhanced training, Morrison said during one session, but external monitoring suggests we can't manage our own workforce and personnel decisions need to remain internal. Your track record suggests you can't manage your workforce fairly, Maria replied. 7 years of systematic discrimination against pregnant employees isn't an accident. It's a policy failure that requires external oversight. The breakthrough came when David Chen, who'd been largely silent throughout the negotiations, finally spoke up. This is to stop, he said, surprising everyone. The investigation uncovered things I didn't know were happening, comments and decisions that don't reflect our values. If external monitoring helps us do better, then maybe that's what we need. Morrison looked like he wanted to strangle his client, but Chen continued. We can't keep losing talented women because of outdated attitudes. Sarah brought in millions of dollars for this company, and we almost lost her because of poor judgment and worse management. The admission created momentum for a comprehensive settlement. Over the following days, working through our attorneys, we hammered out the details. A settlement of $275,000, my immediate reinstatement to full responsibilities upon my return from maternity leave, mandatory quarterly training for all management, Personnel, policy changes that explicitly protected pregnant employees and working mothers, and 18 months of external monitoring by an employment law expert, Carrie Karen. Walsh would be reassigned to a role with no personnel responsibilities and would be required to complete additional training before being considered for any supervisory positions. This sets a strong precedent, the EEOC representative told me after the final terms were agreed upon. Other companies will take notice, and other women will benefit from the policies you've helped establish. The settlement wasn't just about money, it was about creating systemic change that would protect future employees. The external monitoring meant that the company would be held accountable for their treatment of pregnant employees and working mothers. The policy changes would be permanent, outlasting any individual manager or executive. Most importantly, the settlement included provisions for other affected employees. Women who'd been pushed out or demoted after taking maternity leave would be eligible for their own settlements and, if they chose, opportunities to return to the company under the new policies. As I signed the agreement, my daughter kicked forcefully, as if she approved of what we'd accomplished together. We hadn't just won a legal victory. We'd changed an entire company's culture and practices, and we'd done it without backing down, without accepting their discrimination, without quietly disappearing. As they'd expected, the fight was over, but the real victory was just beginning. The settlement was finalized on a Friday afternoon in November. I sat in Maria's office, 8.5 months pregnant, signing the final documents that would transform not just my situation, but the entire culture at Meridian Corporation. The terms were everything we'd fought for and more. The financial settlement of $275,000 was substantial, but the systemic changes were the real victory. The company would implement comprehensive new policies protecting pregnant employees and working mothers, conduct mandatory training for all management personnel, and submit to external monitoring for 18 months. You should be proud, Maria said as I signed the last page. This settlement will protect countless women who come after you. But the real vindication came in the form of a letter from Meridian's new CEO, Robert Harrison, who'd been brought in to clean up the company's image and practices. The letter was both an apology and a commitment to change. Miss Mitchell, we deeply regret the treatment you experienced at our company. The discrimination you faced was unacceptable and violated both our stated values and federal law. We are committed to ensuring that no employee ever faces such treatment again. The letter went on to outline specific policy changes, pregnancy discrimination awareness training for all managers, clear procedures for handling maternity leave requests, and a new reporting system for discrimination complaints that bypassed HR entirely. Most satisfying was the announcement that Karen Walsh had been removed from any role involving personnel decisions and would undergo extensive retraining before being considered for any supervisory position. David Chun, while remaining in his role, would be required to attend quarterly discrimination prevention training and would have his personnel decisions reviewed by the external monitor. The company also issued a public statement acknowledging the settlement and their commitment to creating an inclusive workplace. While they didn't admit wrongdoing, that was part of the negotiation. The statement was clear enough that anyone reading it would understand what had happened. The industry response was immediate and telling. Within days, I received calls from headhunters and executives at other companies, some offering jobs, others asking about my experience and how they could avoid similar problems at their organizations. You've become a symbol, one recruiter told me. Women across the industry are talking about your case, about the importance of standing up to discrimination. More meaningful were the personal messages from women. I'd never met employees at other companies who'd faced similar discrimination and had been inspired by my fight to speak up about their own experiences. Some were filing their own complaints. Others were working with their employers to improve policies and practices. Jessica Martinez called to thank me personally. Because of what you did, I was eligible for a settlement too, she said. But more than that, you gave me back my confidence. I'd started to believe that maybe I really wasn't cut out for my job after having kids. Maria Santos had returned to Meridian under the new policies, accepting a position that restored her client-facing responsibilities and career trajectory. The culture is completely different now, she told me. Pregnancy isn't treated like a disease anymore. 3 weeks before my due date, I received an unexpected visit at home from Robert Harrison himself. He came to personally apologize and to assure me that my position would be waiting when I returned from maternity leave. "I've reviewed your personnel file," he said. "Your performance has been exceptional, and the company was foolish to jeopardize a relationship with someone of your caliber. I want to personally guarantee that you'll have full support when you return." He also brought news that filled me with pride. Meridian had received inquiries from other major corporations about their new pregnancy discrimination policies. The changes we'd forced them to implement were becoming a model for other companies. "You didn't just change our company," Harrison said. "You've started an industry-wide conversation about how to properly support working mothers." The external monitor, Dr. Elizabeth Chang from Northwestern University's Business School, had already begun her work. Her first quarterly report noted significant improvements in how pregnancy announcements were received and maternity leave requests were handled. "The culture shift is remarkable," she told me during a phone call. "Managers who once saw pregnancy as a problem now see it as an opportunity to demonstrate supportive leadership." But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from my own team at Meridian. They'd organized a baby shower for me, something that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Michael, who'd been given my responsibilities during the discrimination, publicly acknowledged my contributions to the projects he'd managed. Sarah's strategies and client relationships were what made these campaigns successful, he said during my shower. I was just implementing her vision. The restoration of my professional respect felt almost as important as the financial settlement. I wasn't just the woman who'd filed a discrimination complaint. I was the talented marketing director who'd brought millions of dollars to the company and had rightfully demanded equal treatment. As I prepared for maternity leave, I did so with confidence that my position would be secure, my responsibilities intact, and my career trajectory uncompromised. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated my pregnancy had been replaced by pride and anticipation. I fought for myself, for my daughter, and for every woman who would come after us. And we'd won not just a legal victory, but a complete transformation of an entire company's culture and practices. The little girl who would soon arrive would enter a world where her mother's pregnancy was celebrated, not penalized. That was the greatest victory of all. Emma Sarah Mitchell entered the world on December 15th at 6:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She had Tom's dark hair and what the nurses assured me were my determined eyes. As I held her for the first time, I whispered in her ear, "You helped Mommy fight for what's right, little one." The 12 weeks of maternity leave that followed were everything I'd hoped they would be. Peaceful, bonding time with my daughter without the specter of job insecurity hanging over us. I received regular updates from work, not as veiled threats about my absence, but as genuine efforts to keep me connected and informed. Michael sent weekly reports on the projects I'd be resuming. David checked in periodically to see how I was doing, and even some of the clients I'd worked with sent congratulatory flowers and notes. The contrast with the hostile environment I'd left behind was remarkable. When Emma was 8 weeks old, I received a call that would change everything again, but this time in a positive way. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a friend from my Northwestern MBA program, had heard about my case and was launching a consulting firm focused on helping companies develop family-friendly workplace policies. "I need someone with your expertise and your experience," she said during our coffee meeting. "You understand both the business side and the legal implications. You've lived through the discrimination and fought for change. The opportunity was intriguing. I could help other companies avoid the mistakes Meridian had made, develop policies that actually supported working parents, and create cultures where pregnancy was seen as a natural part of career progression rather than a liability. I'd be building something new, I told Tom that evening. Something that could help women across the country. What does your heart tell you? He asked, bouncing Emma on his knee. I looked at my daughter, this little person who'd been with me through the hardest fight of my professional life, and I knew what I wanted to do. I returned to Meridian for 6 months, fulfilling my commitment and ensuring a smooth transition of my responsibilities. The culture had indeed changed dramatically. Pregnant employees were supported rather than marginalized. Managers celebrated family milestones rather than viewing them as inconveniences, and the company's policies had become a model for the industry. My own return was seamless. My office had been restored, my projects were waiting, and my team welcomed me back enthusiastically. But after 6 months, I knew it was time to move on to something bigger. Rodriguez and Mitchell Consulting launched in September, with 3 major corporate clients and a growing reputation in the field of workplace equality. Our mission was simple: help companies create cultures where talented people could thrive regardless of their family status. Our first major success came with a tech startup that was struggling with retention among female employees. After implementing our recommendations, transparent maternity leave policies, lactation support, flexible work arrangements, and manager training, their retention rate among new mothers increased from 34% to 87%. Word spread quickly through professional networks. Within a year, we were working with Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, and everything in between. Each client represented dozens or hundreds of women who would benefit from fair treatment and equal opportunities. I often thought about Jessica, Maria, Linda, and all the other women who'd been pushed out before I found the courage to fight back. Some had joined other companies under better circumstances. Others had started their own businesses, and a few had even returned to careers they thought were lost forever. The ripple effects of our case extended far beyond Meridian Corporation. Employment attorneys across the country were using our settlement as a template for their own cases. HR professionals were citing our policy changes as best practices. Business schools were teaching case studies based on our experience. Emma, now 80 months old, often came to the office with me, playing in the corner while I worked on presentations about creating family-friendly workplaces. She was living proof that women could be both devoted mothers and successful professionals when given the support and respect they deserved. Sometimes, I wondered what would have happened if I'd accepted Curran's suggestion to find a new job that's more compatible with your new priorities. How many other talented women would have been lost? How many companies would have continued discriminating without consequence? But I didn't dwell on those questions. Instead, I focused on the future we were building, a world where Emma and her generation would never have to choose between having children and having careers, where pregnancy would be celebrated as a normal part of life rather than treated as a professional liability. The fight that began with Karen Walsh's discriminatory comments had evolved into something I never could have imagined. A career dedicated to ensuring that other women wouldn't face the same challenges I had. Every policy we helped implement, every culture we helped transform, every woman whose career we helped protect was a victory not just for them, but for all. The daughters who would inherit the workplaces we were creating. Emma gurgled happily from her playpen, reaching for the toy blocks that spelled out equality. She didn't know she was growing up in a world that her mother had helped change. A world where her pregnancy announcement would someday be met with congratulations rather than discrimination. That was my legacy, not just the legal victory or the financial settlement, but the knowledge that I'd helped create a better world for my daughter. and all the daughters who had come after her. The woman who'd walked into Curran Walsh's office seeking support for her maternity leave had been transformed into an advocate for working families everywhere. It had been worth every moment of the fight.